grew up in Glassboro, New Jersey. At Glassboro State College, he earned a BA in Education, an MA in Special Education, and an MA in Administration. He taught special education and alternative education classes and was the first principal of Cumberland County Vocational Technical Center. He and his family relocated to Alma, Maine, where they lived for 16 years. While there, he was part of the Alma Historical Society and helped with the Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington Railway Museum. As curator, he authored the book, The Narrow Gauge Railroad in Alma, Maine. Also, while there, I know that he restored and built timber frame structures. Is that correct? Yeah. Yes. So he's a well-rounded person, as most of you probably know. As a member of the Broad Street Cemetery Association, he wrote and published the book Broad Street Cemetery, Bridgeton, New Jersey, A History 1791 to 2013 and Guide. His interest in history began in high school, and since his retirement in 2000, he has been able to collect local history and write about various subjects. I can attest to his well-roundedness and overall general interest in many things, but his interest in Chamberlain is what we're here to talk about today. So, without further ado.
Well, thank you for coming. I'm glad to see so many faces in the audience. I see a lot of familiar faces, and I hope they learn something new. George Agnew Chamberlain. I feel that he was, to me, he's a friend. Even though I never knew the gentleman, in the 9 years I've been researching him, and all of the information that I've come up with about his life and the things that he did, I wish I had known him personally. But I do feel like I do know him from what I've written on him. He wrote 13 South Jersey novels, plus one more, which I'll save for the very end. It is often said you can't see the forest for the trees. And in some ways, this applies to this author. I mean, everywhere I go, I ask people, who's George Agnew Chamberlain? And I get mostly a blank look. Maybe I'm not asking the right people, I'm not sure. But, yeah, out of maybe 9 out of 10 people, even though he lived here from 1927 until he died in 1966, right in Salem County, but he was his mother lived in Bridgeton, and when she came back from South America. By the way, he was born in South America to missionary parents. They were in San Paulo. He grew up there until he was age 13, and then he came to this country for his education. He spent time in Pennsylvania, Connecticut, New York. Some of those schools he made out fine, other ones they threw him out. It wasn't until he really got to Lawrenceville that he really found himself, and that's when his writing abilities really started to show. He wrote for the magazine that they had at Lawrenceville, and he became their editor, and some of the writings are, very interesting. But I guess I did detect a good writer in his letters home from age 13 on, because he wrote, they wrote back and forth during this time. Then he went on to Princeton and was there for 2 years, and then after 2 years he went back to South America, and that's where he started selling books out in the outback, I guess. But that didn't last long because somebody offered him a job as a clerk at a at the consulate. And that's when he got interested in the diplomatic corps. But after that, he was there for a short period of time. He came back to the United States, to the New Mexico territory, because he got sick, and they said it would be good for him to go to a dry climate. So that's how he wound up in New Mexico. He became a cowpoke, but he also helped found a Spanish-speaking newspaper called El Faro. In San Paulo, it was very interesting. His mother started a school there. It was a school for small children, but it was a school that took in both boys and girls. Now, this was in the 1870s. This was a time when this was not that common. And what's more interesting about it is it went on to become the University of San Paulo. So he had a very interesting background. He did a lot of research here in South Jersey. He started writing these novels in 1923, his first one. And then he didn't write too many at that point until 1930s. And then there was a time that he wasn't writing anything about South Jersey, and then he came back and started again. Another interesting fact about him is he's the only author I've been able to find for New Jersey that has 7 movies made from his stories. 3 of them about South Jersey. And we'll get into that in a little bit. I'm not sure whether am I coming across now? Am I coming across now? Okay. He called this area the Barrens. He didn't call it the Pine Barrens, he just called it the Barrens. And when you read some of his books and the descriptions that he gives of them, I'm sure you will be familiar with it. He's painted a very vivid picture of some of the areas very close to here in Salem and Cumberland County. He did go into the Pine Barrens around Weymouth and that area for a couple of stories, but most of them are concentrated right here in the Bridgeton, Salem area. One of the things that he wrote, he said, "No man knows all the roads. Under dogwood in May and through tunnels of laurel in June, they twine, they intertwine, and circle back on themselves in a maze that defies memory and makes a joke out of the most acute sense of direction. Under high timber, they plunge to the verge of some impassable run or cease. There is no path to the right or left, only that moss-grown road that goes nowhere, looking surprised as the rider who discovers its meaningless end. To find himself, he must peer upward through the brush towards the light, and emerging on a thin crest of stunted pine and oak, hear the laughter of the Barrens, as he realizes that the lost road of today was only 100 yards from the lost road of yesterday." That's one of his descriptions from one of his books. And how many of you have felt that living here in the Barrens? Okay. All right. By the way, you may ask me questions anytime. I'm not averse to stopping and.
What was his first book?
What was his first book? His first book was Home, and it was written while he was in the diplomatic corps, and it tells about people that are out of the country in all parts of the world and their desire to come home. His first book, when it was published initially, was published anonymously. And then when it took off and really started selling, then they attached his name to it. So that's how he got his start. Home is And then there are variations on that. There was a movie called Coming Home, and then there was a play called Lost that was based on it. So there are, many things that he wrote that go around this theme of, coming back. All right, his first book on South Jersey was Highboy Rings Down the Curtain. Does anybody have any idea what this might be about? Highboy Rings Down the Curtain. Well, that's what I thought when I read the title initially, Highboy Rings Down the Curtain. It's about a horse. And it's about a horse that meets an untimely death. And he describes, the horse and what the owner goes through when he loses his horse, or his first horse, and then he trains his second horse, and eventually he loses that horse too. And it's based on here in the probably outside of Bridgeton towards Port Norris area. So it's a book that he did for a giveaway. He had 300 of them printed, and he gave them away to his friends as Christmas presents. And they were printed at the Bridgeton Evening News. They have a cloth cover on them, and they're only about that thick. But it was such a good story that later on in the 1940s, it was featured in some anthologies of well-known horse stories. So that was his first one in 1923.
Jim, would that have been inspired by the horse racing that was done in the Bridgeton area?
I'm not sure. Possible. He always liked horses. I mean, he rode horses from the time he was a child in Brazil, right on up through. So he always had an affinity to the horses. And he owned several of them over the years. In the book he called this Highboy a rebellious gelding. And when you read the descriptions of it and how it was finally tamed, but then towards the end, when it meets its demise, I think you'll enjoy it if you get a chance to get a copy of it. They're not available, as far as I know, out on the net. You've got to find somebody that's got a copy. I have a copy, or I have several of them, so if anyone would like to borrow it, I'm willing to lend it out. But that's his first South Jersey novel, and that was in 1923. His next one, and again, tell me what you think the title is. The Lantern on the Plow.
What do you mean, that is the title?
Yeah, I know. No, I mean, what's the title mean? The Lantern on the Plow. Plowing at night, that's part of it, right? Well, it's not so strange because he was influenced by a short paragraph that he found in the Bridgeton Evening News about the, quote, arrest of a farmer for not sending his children to school. The farmer's defense intrigued him. The farmer told the judge, quote, I had to plow all day and then by lantern light to feed them. So that's how he came up with the title, The Lantern on the Plow. And evidently it must have been a true story as far as that aspect of it goes. The farmer lived near, on the road from Fryersburg to Deerfield, near the lake, near Bostwick Lake. And there are some pictures in these books over here of the house. And he describes it as the house where the farmer lived was made of roughly hewn blocks of Jersey stone, surmounted by a sagging gabled roof of heavy shingles, and a lean-to of wood built against the rear. In the gabled end of the kitchen section of the house was a blackish gray stone which bore the inscription 1727. And that house is still there, and you can still see that stone. If you want to ride up to Boswick Lake and look at the sandstone house, it's right to the west of the lake. That's where the setting was. But then he goes into, evidently the farmer couldn't make it as a farmer just doing dirt crops. So he decided to see what else he could do, and he went into quarrying. And the story then gets into digging out the earth and finding stuff that could be used to make cement. And it has an interesting ending. It also has a lot of romance of younger people in it, of his daughter and some of her beaux, and where she would go to school. She went to school at what would be Ivy Hall today. In the same book, he describes a lot of Bridgeton, and he describes Ivy Hall, which he calls Myrtle Manor. I don't know. Can you hear me without this thing?
No,
Yes.
You can't hear me without?
not everyone can.
Not everyone can. Okay. I have to get used to this. I'm not used to talking at anything. And you gotta get real close. That's
No, you're fine.
You can hear me if I'm that far away?
Yeah.
Oh,
Pull
okay.
it a little.
A little closer?
A little closer, and then
A
you're
little
fine.
closer? How that?
Yeah,
That's
perfect.
good.
Okay, because I can't hear it the same way I can hear it if I hear it this way. But you can hear it, that's fine. Okay. All right. Myrtle Manor was a finishing school located in the principal town of the 3 counties. Now he's describing Bridgeton at this point. Built of blood red brick. Now you can't hear me, right? Not, now you can't hear me. I gotta put it down here like this, right? How about now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Shutters of solid wood and white trimmings on its easterly exposure. This edifice stood 4 stories high. In addition, to accommodate the rush of prosperous years, a 2-story wing had been thrown out to the north, which reached the edge of the woods, whose shadows descended to meet and mix with those of trees that interlaced their tops above the abandoned raceway. So, does that give you a pretty good description of out back of Ivy Hall? Okay. At night, on the raceway, in a canoe, if you looked upwards through the branches, which reaching from each bank barely touched their tips, it seemed that the spangled stars had descended to form an elongated Milky Way for her special benefit. And this is talking about being in a canoe, going down the raceway, heading towards the lake. Okay. So that's just a couple of descriptions, but he also described the old Broad Street Church as it was in the 1920s. And there's also another description there of Cumberland County as a whole and what was going on with the farming and the things that were being done in Cumberland County in the 1920s. At this time, it was written C.F. Seabrook's construction company was laying the new concrete road through Seabrook Village. And there seems to be an indication that this was that this was what the story referred to when he talked about the roads, the one road he was talking about. Also, Dr. Mary Walker may be modeled after Dr. Mary Bacon as head of Myrtle Manor. So he brought into his stories a lot of the local people. He did say at times that he didn't model any of these people on people that were here, but it's obvious that he wasn't really telling the straight story there. Because they always said, if you don't want to wind up in one of his books, don't talk to him. All right, Man Alone was his next book. And this is about Bridgeton, and it's about the glass industry. It starts out, though, with a man and his son leaving North Jersey after a bad marriage and coming south. He describes some of the roads that they traveled on getting down to Hopetown. Of course, Hopetown at that point was Bridgeton. They stopped at an inn outside of Bridgeton, which would be where Woodland Country Day School is today, when that was an inn. What he wanted to do is he wanted to mine sand, and he finally wound up down in the area where the sand mines are. But after he did that for a while, then he came back into Bridgeton and started a glass company. His dream was to build his own glass works in Hopetown. Chamberlain had an association with the owner of the Cumberland Glass Company, and that's where he got most of his information from the owner. And he was able to describe in detail the workings of a glass factory because of this. One of the best passages out of there I believe is this one. The great ramshackle shed, spreading its wings over the furnace it had taken so many months to build, became a spontaneous foil. Against its shadow stood silhouetted the figures of men at work and dots of golden light. The red full moon of a ring pole, the pipe thrust in, twirled, and brought out with a golden ball on its lower end. The ball rolled on a marble slab, heated again, and then handed to the blower. Here began the minutes of never-ending fascination, of movements apparently slow and yet incredibly swift in their results. The man would first blow lightly, drawing out the vitreous mass to the shape of a pear. Balancing his pipe in a vertical line, he would raise it swiftly, gathering the glass downward. Then came the move to the foot bench, over the swing hole, and immediately the swift rise of action. The workman's breath, aided by the motion like the swing of a pendulum, blowing harder and harder. The pear becomes a high cylinder, swaying in a wide and wider arc. The workman changes his grip constantly, twirling the glass, holding it against too quick a flow. Sometimes to show off, he whirls the whole mass in a vast circle, broadening steadily to the lengthening of the glass. He slows down, and as by miracle, there has been no crash, no disastrous thud. He brings the oval tip to the heat of the furnace, softens it, pierces it. By a balancing movement, the opening is increased to an even circle, and its edges paired. The cylinder becomes firm and is laid in a rack. A thread of hot glass is wound around its closed extremity and touched with a cold iron rod. More magic. The end drops off. The red-hot iron is passed swiftly in a straight line from end to end within the open tube. A touch from the wetted finger and the cylinder divides along a straight line. It goes to the flattening oven, where under the manipulations of the flattener it lies down as if tired out, opening slowly into a sheet of glass. Now that's just one description. in this book of the glass industry. And I found it very interesting because my great-grandfather worked in the glass factories in Bridgeton at one time. And this description is during the time of the Civil War and the time when the boys were getting ready, the 3rd Regiment was getting ready to leave Bridgeton. And then he goes on and he describes what glass making is like in Glassboro and Worcesterburg. And the story of the man and his boy is a story of the man is very upset with women. And he initially passes this on to his son, but then his son finds the right partner, the right person, and things sort of straighten out. He also mentions Ghoultown and one of the women that worked for him in their house. So he takes the whole Bridgeton area, but it was so well received that an autographed copy of this book was sent to Mrs. Coolidge in 1926 as part of the sesquicentennial. It was taken down by the Chamber of Commerce from Bridgeton and given to her. If some of you want to do some research, maybe you can find out if it still exists. It must be down there in Washington somewhere. Okay.
That's still man alone?
Man alone. Yeah, man alone. And again, for the title, you wouldn't, he was very good at that, at disguising what was going on in his book. He wrote over 43 novels, plus 2 non-fiction books, and hundreds of articles, he was published in, as far as I could find, so far, 16 different magazines. He had 43 of his stories in the Saturday Evening Post. So he got around. And Hollywood liked him too. Okay, the next one. And we're now in the late 20s. The Taken Child. Anybody familiar with this? Yeah. I know you are. The Taken Child. What's it sound like? Somebody got kidnapped, right? Actually, it's a euphemism for adopted child. And that's the way, at that time, that was what they used. If you got somebody from an orphanage or from some other place, that was a taken child. And this taken child has its roots in Rhodetown. And the man's name that he modeled it after is Garrison. And it's a story of this child starting out in a different state, coming up through a circus to New Jersey. The circus goes bust. The child doesn't have any more employment. He gets taken to Trenton and put in the orphanage up there. And this farmer is looking for somebody to help him on this farm. He goes up there and he takes the child and brings him back to Rhodetown and discovers that he has a real knack with horses. And of course, any of you that might know about Garrison, he was a very famous sulky driver. And that's the story that develops of him, from a child growing up into a man and being part of, the sulky races.
He actually uses his name, Garrison, in the novel?
No.
Yeah, right.
But, that's who it was. And the other thing he did in this was the beginning of his starting to tell about all of the different things that go on in sulky racing, all the different terminologies that they used, which he then uses in his later books about horses. He described the weights on their toes to make them trot, and hopples to make them pace. In other words, he's talking about how they were training them. The shadow rules to keep them from looking down, poles to head them straight, and boots of every description, ankle boots, knee boots, and suspenders. These are all things that were used, in the training of these horses. There was also a rear contraption known as a spreader to hold their knees apart, and another contrivance, a stiff leather bib that kept the horse from eating his blanket. Now, I never knew of any of these until I read this book. And the more I read, the more interested I got into knowing, because I like sulky races. We used to go to them all the time when we lived in Maine, at the county fairs up there. And, but I never knew, what it took to
train them.
Train a horse to be, in those races. So this young boy starts out at about 13 or 14 racing, and it describes how he gets into the races and how it's a pretty cutthroat thing, these races. They do everything they can do to keep you from winning, or passing. If you're in the second row, your chances of getting to the first row and winning are pretty non-existent. But he learns how to do this. I mean, they would lock wheels and all kinds of different things. He wrote another story about horses called 7/8 of an inch. And that was the difference between the spread of the wheels. 7/8 of an inch would allow him to then move over and push somebody else's sulky out of the way. I didn't know what 7/8 meant either when I first started to read it. It's a pretty heartwarming story. It involves thrills and local South Jersey characters. There's also the element of love, not of horses, but of boy towards girl. So he intertwines this in his stories also. Any questions? Night at Lost End. Night at Lost End. Doesn't bring anything to mind? Okay.
Sea breeze?
Okay, that's pretty good. Well, actually, Night at Lost End begins in New York City and comes down to a place called Dropped Wing in South Jersey. Dropped Wing. Okay. Dropped Wing is his house called Lloyd's Landing. But he uses his house in a lot of these novels, but he also calls them by different names. In this particular novel, he called it Dropped Wing because it was the high part of the house, and then there was a low part of the house. That was the Dropped Wing. And so this guy is tired of, what's going on in New York. It's during the Depression. So he meets this fellow that has this property down here and decides to come down and caretake it. But the story is actually a murder mystery romance novel. And when he gets down here, what he finds is a girl who's in the main house. He's living in the place called Lost End, which is the other property that the guy owns, but next door to the big house. And he finds a girl in the big house who then he's curious to find out why she's there. I mean, there should not be anybody there. So this is where the mystery comes in, and later the romance. Also, in Chamberlain's books, if you read all 43 of them, and you read his life, and you read what he did, all around, you see that he brings out, in some aspects, his life. His autobiography is in a lot of his writings, especially in some of his earlier writings. Through Stained Glass, which is about his childhood growing up in South America, and his father and mother and the adventures that he has at that time. But here he talks about this guy coming down from New York. He said this person had known girls by the dozen. Okay, that's a little clue right there. In each of these corvées, there had been an occasional girl with a tolerant gleam of humor in her eye, who quietly lived up to the high water mark of lovableness in any generation. To such he gave their due. On the whole, he had taken a fairly representative cross-section of his own world. He had also fished infrequently in the shallower waters of the chorus, and rarely wandered still further afield, always seeking and yet never quite knowing what he sought. What he did was that he hadn't found it. And to me, that's a perfect description of George Agnew Chamberlain. And you'll see in the last novel that I'm going to talk about today, which I believe is a semi-autobiography of his life, some more of this type of talk. And when you read the letters that he wrote and the people that he was in contact with, and the women that he knew all over the world, this is pretty representative of George Agnew Chamberlain.
What does it represent?
Was he a womanizer?
His secretary in 1951-52 was a girl just graduated from high school. And she worked for him summers typing his books. And that's one of the descriptions he came up with. Because she had asked him, why didn't you ever get married? And his quote answer was, well, I had enough women. Okay.
But he had a daughter. Are you going to tell us about his OW child?
Oh, I wasn't, but we might get into it.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
Is he carrying on his work in diplomacy while he's writing all these books?
Yes.
So he's traveling around.
Right. He started out as a consul in Pernambuco, Brazil, northern Brazil. And he was writing stories at that time and publishing them in different magazines. Then after that, he got promoted to Portuguese East Africa. And that's where he wrote Home in Portuguese East Africa and a couple of other of his books. He was there for a period of time that allowed him to write stories and books. Then he came back to this country, or back to Mexico, and he was writing all the time. He always said, in a lot of his quotes, that he wrote his best stuff on Europe while he was in America, and his best stuff on America while he was in Africa or some other place outside of the country.
So most of his articles were fiction?
No, he wrote a lot of articles for periodicals at the beginning.
They weren't.
They were not fiction. They were not fiction. Right. He started publishing articles in periodicals in 1904. and they were not. But what he found out was what he was getting paid for those periodical articles wasn't cutting it.
Yeah, and the money he was getting paid went down, right?
Right, that's later. When he started writing novels, and all of his novels are based on a serial that was also published in a magazine. And he was getting anywhere from, in the beginning, $10,000 till up to $27,000 to $30,000 for one serial, which he then turned into a novel. So, but that changed later on, as he got older, and it got harder and harder. He had to really negotiate to get good money for his later novels. But he did get good money out of Hollywood too. For his one film, he got $17,000 just for the story.
When was that? What year?
That was in the 40s. Yeah.
Are those films available?
Pardon?
Are those films available?
Red House is. I know it's here somewhere. There it is. Pass that back. That was available on VCR, and it may be put on the disc now by now. Okay?
Is the only one?
That's the only one I've been able to find so far. Like I say, the three of his movies were done on South Jersey. None of them filmed in South Jersey. That one was filmed in California. Another one was filmed in the middle of the country. And the third one was filmed in California. So he wrote about South Jersey, and the stories are about South Jersey, but none of the films were made in South Jersey.
That's the way they did it.
Okay, so that finishes his stories in the 20s. Now, as he approaches his 30s, for some reason, he doesn't write any more South Jersey novels. He has a slow time there. He's writing other novels. He's writing about the Caribbean. He's writing about Africa. He's writing about South America, Mexico. So maybe he didn't have time to write about South Jersey at that point. But then as we get into the 40s, the beginning of the 40s, his first novel there was called The Phantom Filly. And this is based on Lloyd's Landing, which he called by a different name, and Cunday's farm, which was next door. Okay, and there was a movement between these two, and that's where this Phantom Filly came from. The owner didn't know that, that horse had been sired by one of his horses, and it went on to become, a pretty good racehorse. It has suspense, color, setbacks, and thrills of unpredictable sport. It was set in Salem County at Roundhouse and Low Meadows horse farms. So he called Lloyd's Landing Roundhouse, and he called the other one Low Meadows. And it's about an orphan boy who, and two girls. That's the romance part of it. Both of them having at the other ranch, or at the other place, not where he lived. It includes some shrewd, slow-moving old Negro grooms who furnish delightful comedy. I mean, that's, you have to think of the time period that this was written. Earlier stuff was not quite as kind. Some of the things that were said in some of the earlier books. But again, it wasn't out of character for the time period. Okay, the kid's name is Sparky. The field was drawing up on Sparky. This is a race now. It was closing the gap, and the hammering of those approaching hooves threw Mauden 4 into a near panic. That's the name of the horse he had. Yet Sparky knew he had to look down. He had to find out what Fleetfoot was watching. He did and saw what Thunder had guessed from far away. A sulky is so balanced that the driver, by throwing his weight to one side of the seat, can make the frame protrude beyond the line of his wheel was traveling. That's what Fleetfoot had done. He had locked his frame ahead of Sparky's, and only a master driver would have dared to try to hold it there. There was no way out for Sparky ahead. With the field blanketing him, it was too late to back and go around. So he lost that race, but he learned some things. In the description there, you can see he learned some of the other things that sulky drivers did to win their races. This film caught the eye of 20th century, or this novel caught the eye of 20th Century Fox. And they did negotiations, which took about a year. But finally, in 1943, the filming began in September, again in California. There were other locations besides California. There was New York, Ohio, Kentucky, and they named the film Home in Indiana. Anybody remember seeing Home in Indiana? Okay. How about April Love? Okay, April Love was a remake of Home in Indiana. Okay, so if Pat Boone, right? Yeah.
That was really good. That's really hard. It's got like a cold.
It got good reviews, and it was called at the time one of the best horse films that had been made. There had been made several of them earlier in the 30s and earlier in the 40s that had gotten good reviews, but this one seemed to outshine even those. What time we got here? Ooh, 4:03, huh?
Where's Lloyd's Landing?
Where's Lloyd's? Lloyd's Landing is on the Alloways Creek, and it's right on the borderline between Alloway and Quinton. If you go into Quinton to the traffic light before you go across the bridge, make a right and go up a couple of miles, and it would be way back in. You can't see it from the... There was a time you could probably see it when he had all the fields cleared, when he was doing farming. George was also a farmer. He raised tomatoes and soybean and other types of crops there at one time. And in fact, the field that's out in front was an airport at one time for Amelia Earhart and Jimmy Doolittle. They would fly in there when they would visit him.
The entrance to his lane has the name Schisler on it. It's right there on the radio. You can see it.
Right.
You can see it from the river if you're kayaking.
Yeah, you can see it from the river too.
And is it a brick house? Is it a brick?
Yes. It's a brick. There's some good photographs of it here in the material up here. It was a place that he bought in 1927. Spent like $40,000 getting it an addition added to it and remodeling it. In the 30s, when Prohibition was in, he had people that would bring him spirits up the river and drop them off at Lloyd's Landing. And in his guest book, there are things like wet. real wet. Really, really wet. So they were the times that, he had gotten a shipment and was able to, they were able to imbibe. There were other times when they said dry. So, yeah.
Where is the guest book? Is it in the collection in Salem?
No, the guest book is with the family. I have a copy of it.
Good.
Family copied it for me. And there's, in this one, well, on that board there, is Amelia Earhart's signature in the guest book. And that's one of, a lot of other, the Gishes sign, Lillian Gish. There are all kinds of
Jean-Jacques Lebord.
Pardon?
Jean-Jacques Lebord.
I could not find her signature in there, even though he was supposedly dating her at one time. About the same time Seabrook was dating her, I believe. Yeah, there are many interesting stories about George. Now, is anybody dry? Can we get wet? Can we take a little break for about 5 minutes or so? I think everybody's tired of sitting right in that. Before are some other information about the novels or about the research leading, up to what I've been talking about today. All right, now we're in the 40s. We've already got, I'll pass this around too. We've already got Home in Indiana. This is one of the advertising sheets that they did for the film. What I found interesting was that Chamberlain never attended any of the grand openings of any of his films. I wish I had him around here so I could ask him why. But he never did. He never attended any of them. All right, next title. Bride of Bridal Hill. Bride of Bridal Hill. Somebody getting married?
Another horse?
No? This one's about dogs. Okay? And it comes from the serial that he wrote called Laverack of Sarah Run. Sarah Run. Does anybody know where Sarah Run is in South Jersey?
It's about 49 or 49.
Right. If you've ever traveled on 49 in Marlboro, you've crossed Sarah Run. Okay? So he wrote this serial called Laverack of Sarah Run. And it's about three brothers from Deerfield who raised setters. And they raised them for hunting, and they also raised them for show. And their name was Cattell. Okay? You've heard of the name of Cattell here in South Jersey. They lived on Route 540. And he sets this thing in Alloway, or in Alloway Township down near the water, in a place called Yard's Mound. So he changes the names, but you know it's the Cattell brothers because I've talked with relatives of the Cattells. And George used to go there and eat dinner after the hunting. He would go there and hunt with the brothers. They had, in the fields that they had, they would hunt quail and grouse and then at the end of the day, they would go to the house and have a meal.
When was that?
When was that? That was in the 40s. That was in the 40s. And these guys were so well known that people would come from all over. There were ex-governors and doctors and everybody that would come down to Deerfield to hunt with this group. So anyway, there was a dog called Birdie, and Birdie is the bride of Bridal Hill. George Mound was a real location in the Alloways Creek area. He discovered it in 1938 when he became lost in the woods. And Chamberlain had a way of becoming lost in the woods a lot from his descriptions. He was following, and this is his words, a faint woods trail on horseback, and he rode a lot of the Barrens on horseback. I mean, he would travel for miles in the woods, and there's a story about where he was traveling one time near Ranch Hope, and there was a mill there. A fellow owned a mill there, and as he and his friends that were riding with him got close to the mill, the guy said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "We're riding through." He says, "Well, get off of my property." And George said to him, "Well, do you know who I am? I'm George Agnew Chamberlain." And he said, quote, and I won't say what he said, "Out of here." He didn't care whether it was George Agnew Chamberlain or not. Okay, he was riding a woods trail on horseback and broke through a screen of scrub oak. Chinquapin. What's the chinquapin?
Chestnut.
Right, a dwarf chestnut, right. And Jack pine into a well-kept field and one of the neatest farm establishments he had ever seen. So here he's basing, modeling the book that he's going to write, the novel he's writing, on this place that he discovered on one of his horseback rides. This became a very popular book. He got a lot of fan mail on this from dog lovers all over. And the start for the story actually goes back as far as 1928. And it began at Lloyd's Landing. And this is right after he had bought the place and had it fixed up. A contractor that was grading the front lawn for him had brought a 6-month-old setter pup who was already, quote, working the fields like a veteran, head high and flat tail. The owner said that the pup, quote, was the last skin of the purest Labrador strain in this country, and that if he died, the breed would die with him. So it took him from 1928, when he had this encounter with this fellow, to when he wrote this story in the 1940s. But he based it on that, basically that comment. And then when he found this house or farm in the middle of nowhere, then things started to gel, and he said it took him sometimes seven years to put a novel together. From the time he started conceiving what it was going to be like till the time he finally, finished writing it. Then other times he could write one in a couple of months. Stories in a couple of months. So that's what Bride of Bridal Hill is. It's about dogs. Knoll Island. And he liked to write about knolls. Several of those books have places that are prominent in the stories that are on a knoll. Knoll Island is set in Lower Alloways Creek Township on Mad Horse Creek. The house described still exists today, and a passage in the book said, 4 windows and 3 doors peered out across the vast marshland. Straight ahead, the low blob of Knoll Island was visible. The family who lived in the house had 3 sons, who after their beloved Jersey Shore was attacked by German subs, knew, quote, that it was their land and their home and life was too small a price to pay to guard it. So, this house still does exist today. And I have some pictures of it. Knoll Island is really Round Island, and if you look on the map, you can find Round Island out there off of Mad Horse Creek. The sons went away to war, some of them to Merchant Marines, some of them into other service. It was at the time that they were rationing gas. They were questioning everybody that had a boat, what they were doing. And it may be that he modeled this after the submarine that came in and let some saboteurs off on the Jersey Shore, which really happened. But I don't want to spoil it for you. I mean, it's too interesting. It's too interesting a story, But I will read a couple of other things here. One of his sons, who was in the Merchant Marines, had joined the Merchant Marines in Philadelphia. As he was sailing down the creek, or down the bay, the river, heading out through the bay, observed this as he was on board ship. Miles of marshland lay exposed to his view. The Alloways, Oak Creek, and the circle that never lost the power to make fools out of those who knew it best. Fishing Creek, leading to Stark's Branch, Mad Horse, with more tentacles than any squid, Deep Creek, Mud Creek, and Stowe, Broad, Shallow, and Long. Skip Bayside with its oyster pier, and you had the marsh again, dotted with islands. Cohansey Creek, thick and twisted like as a python. All the Back Creek region, with more runs and branches than the hair on your head. So this is one of his descriptions of that particular area. Again, does it sound familiar?
Yeah, well,
Okay.
no wonder there were rum runners.
Then came the sabotage, the menace of German sub in Mad Horse Creek that threatens a simple life on the farm. Like I say, Knoll Island is actually Round Island. You used to be able to get there by a series of bridges across the creeks, but I believe all of those are now gone. And I'm not sure, maybe some of the structure on the island is gone. Is there anybody that knows for sure that's been out there, been on the creek?
Yeah, there's a lot.
Okay. So that's what Knoll Island is. All right, now we get to the Red House. And this was what was written on the dust jacket of the Red House. Present day mystery and weird events of the past are skillfully blended into a colorful background of the Jersey Barrens. For nearly half a century, terror of the jumpity Little Red House had held Ellen and Pete Yoakum and Lottie, their colored servant, locked in its coils. That was what they wrote inside the book cover, okay? Now this takes place off of the Quinton to Rosestown Road, near Jericho, Woodmere Lake area. And it came about from a story, I guess, that Jedediah Allen, who was a resident on that road, told a lady by the name of Massey, and then her father took her to look at the cellar bottom for this house. And that's how I found out, a location was, that roundabout way. Jedediah is gone, but this Macy, Joanne Macy Campbell, lives out in Oregon now. And she just happened to be here in the area, and I just happened to run into her, and she told me the story because she knew I was doing some research on Chamberlain. So she sent me some information, and that's how I started to piece things together. In the story, he describes the house as a house of Jersey pink limestone that rose from a knoll like a wart on an ugly head. And the surrounding area, he said, was bayous as sombras as any in the Florida Everglades, widen into creeks that narrow into runs, marshes rise into sparsely wooded tablelands that plunge down unexpectedly into swales darkened by primeval trees. And, when you're out there in some of those places, it can feel like you're in a primeval area. As I was growing up, we did a lot of driving around in the Pine Barrens, and in some ways it has a similar, feel. But there are certain things that are here that are not in the Pine Barrens itself. He also described the roads in the area. Roads that cross each other or intertwine or break at right angles for no reason. Roads that sometimes make a complete circle, like a lost dog. Roads linked to obsolete and forgotten treasures. This to a marl pit, that to a red stone quarry, and another to a bog of buried cedar. Wood roads to rare sand, to vanished cranberry patches, and even to faint earthworks thrown up as far back as the Revolution. Roads that travel through laurel 20 feet high, obliterated roads studded with young pines that end nowhere. Still other roads wide open that tumble downward and cease in surprise at the edge of an impassable void. So that's within that story. Also, he says that he describes the farmhouse as a plank house of 8x8 timbers, mortised at the corners, and it was the oldest of its buildings. The barn was an irregular frame structure that faced open fields, but its rear hung over a deep tarn. There was a lane with power wires tacked from tree to tree that plunged westward for half a mile to a county road, the nearest contact with the outer world. So this is describing, where this place was. Any questions? And he was instrumental in having Edward G. Robinson be the star of the movie. And also the newest person that hadn't been in any big movies before was this Lon McAllister. And again, in another movie, he also wanted Lon McAllister to be, in the movie. By the way, Robinson's wife was from Millville. I already knew that. You'd heard it, okay. In Great Britain, they didn't like the idea of the Red House for some reason, so they changed the title. If you get a book called No Trespassing, that's the Red House. Okay? If it was done in England. And also, while I was researching the movie, the information is in there that they sent to me. They had, I just wrote this down. They had the Red House as being written by Elsie Jerusalem, not George Agnew Chamberlain. So I called him up and I said, I think you got the wrong guy on this movie. And they said, what do you mean? I said, well, you know, it was George Agnew Chamberlain, wasn't this Elsie Jerusalem? So it turns out there is another book called The Red House
Oh, my God.
by Elsie Jerusalem. But it's about a house of prostitution in Vienna.
Fact checker.
I thought that was pretty cool. Okay, the music for this was done by Milkos Rosa, a Greek songwriter, and the score was called Suite in 4 Movements. And the guy that wrote the thing donated he got $800 for doing the music for this movie. He donated this money to the Greek War Relief Association. And like I said earlier, Chamberlain got $17,500 for the movie rights to that movie.
Did he write any of his own screenplays?
Did he write any? No. They wanted him to become a screenwriter, but he didn't want to do it. He had told some people that he really didn't like Hollywood.
You don't have to be.
He liked the money, but he didn't like Hollywood. Okay.
Deal with those people.
Scudda-ho, scudda-hay. Scudda-ho, scudda-hay.
I saw that.
Yeah, you did see that, okay. What's that mean? All right, it has to do with mules.
Yeah.
What's the normal way to change a mule to do something?
G and Hall.
Ian Hall. This happens to be a South Jersey expression. Scudda-ho, scudda-hay. That's, it's something unique to this area
And unique to mules?
and unique to mules. Okay. And the reason he wrote this novel on mules was because of something that Bing Crosby sang called "Swinging on a Star." And in there, one of the lines is, his back is brawny, but his brain is weak. He's just plain stupid with a stubborn streak. And Chamberlain wrote that this is complete sacrilege. The crime of stealing, misusing, violating, or desecrating that which is sacred. To him, mules were sacred because he had grown up with mules from the time he was a child, the time he was in these different countries around the world. He always rode mules. So he was a lover of mules. And so that was the, seed for the story. And the mules come from Paul Cahoot's place. He had a pair of mules, and so developed the story of Scudda-ho, scudda-hay. And it's set in the marshes of Lower Always Creek. He writes, the Jersey side of the delta of the Delaware is cut by tidal creeks that break right and left into guts, branches, and runs. The creeks are navigable, and in spite of having more twists than a flock of snakes, they are roughly parallel. On their upper reaches, each convexity is bordered with overhanging trees, and every outward bulge is a marsh. Winding ditches like bayous break this ordering regularity. Their deep, narrow water, roofed over with alder, ash, foxgapes, and mystery. Away from the creeks, the signposts are spattered with necks, frequently back neck, and any neck means that the way you go in is the way you come out. In the wintertime, the marshes, as well as the guards of the creek, turned a solid brown, but already spring had pushed up the bright green sprouts of sedges, cattails, and three square, while overhead swamp maples were at the end of their showering down their scarlet tassels. Trees on tender leaves spread a haze of green as far as the eye could see. The marshes were ablaze with yellow daisies, fringed with the dark blue spikes of pickerel weed, 3 snowy ibises, played a game of tag above a heavy blue heron, laboring along though there was no breeze to fight. High in the air, the ever-present red-headed vultures circled and soared. Clouds were rising in the west, and each time the boat swung around, their black rampart had billowed higher. The woods were heavy with summer foliage. Sour gums let out the sharpest cry, and a dab of scarlet amid a drooping mass of green. So again, this is how he described, this area. He could look out at his front windows and see a lot of this. Back at this time in the 40s, there was a fellow that came down from the Zoological Society in New York and took a census of all of the different birds that were in the area. And it's a list of almost 50 different birds that he was able to come up with. I doubt you could find half of them today, because some of the names just don't sound familiar. The mules were called Crowder and Moonbeam, and again, there's some romance in it between a boy and a girl, but that was, he based a lot of this. He did a lot of observation of his nieces when they came down to visit, to find the movements and the way they acted as young girls or teenagers. And one of his nieces is the one that told me this. She said, I always saw Uncle George was observing us, writing down things, and then these things would appear in his books. The world premiere for this was held out in Sedalia, Missouri, and the mules that they used came from Texas. They didn't use balls, mules. How many have seen the movie Driving Miss Daisy? Okay. As he's driving her down the main street, there is a movie marquee. And guess what's on the movie marquee? Got a hose, got a hay.
A sidebar to that, Jim, is that it's the first movie that Marilyn Monroe appeared in. She was an extra in that movie.
And they X'd her out.
Is that right?
Yeah. She did some of the things. The only thing you really see of her, she didn't have any speaking parts, is her back as she's walking towards the lake. Yeah.
That was her first ever.
Yeah. Right.
Gotta start somewhere.
Right.
Her back. She's in there.
Here's some of George's writings about mules when he was at Lawrenceville. Okay? He wrote a story about, it included mules when he was, so you can see why he was a little upset with Bing Crosby and calling a mule dumb. And on some of his safaris, he used mules as his means of transportation. Any other questions on who's got a head? There's another movie. Yeah, that's the promotionals that they use. Oh, yeah. Okay, overcoat meeting. Yeah, that's what I said when I first saw the title, overcoat meeting. Well, it has a real, good purpose. This novel really, he in some ways dedicated to Beef Boulder. Anybody ever hear of Beef Boulder? Okay, AKA Bill Davis from Shiloh, the blacksmith. Very good friend of George's. They went around and he appears in several other of his stories of horses. he, again, liked to describe the area in this, but the main thing was that this horse racing, he describes the tracks here in South Jersey, but then, and he also talks about what happens after the season's over, in the fall, when it's cold, and everybody's wearing an overcoat. This is when they would get together and run their horses against each other, bet against each other, and whoever lost had to give the guy his horse. Okay, this was called overcoat meeting. And it went on, not only here, but it went on in Connecticut and other places too. In the dust jacket it said, "Here is the sport as it was and ought to be, founded on the stamina of horse and man, in a warm human story of people who live by simple principles, untouched by the mores of our times." And if you read it, you'll get that flavor from it, as far as the story goes. Their town fair is the one that he talks about a lot in it. Anybody know where the Dare Town Fair was?
Daretown.
Know where the big church is in Dare Town?
Yeah.
That's right in that area is where the fairgrounds was. Questions? All right, now we go to Midnight Boy. Now, Midnight Boy is the one story that he wrote and put into novel form that doesn't concentrate on right here in our area, but it's in the Pine Barrens. It's in the area of Weymouth. This story was written originally as a follow-up story or a sequel to Lassie. Somebody from Hollywood, contacted him and wanted him to write a sequel to Lassie featuring a dog. He couldn't use Lassie as the name of the dog, but he had to come up with a story that was a sequel. And he did. He wrote the story, and they paid him $5,000 for it, and then they turned it down. So he had this story, so then he called it Midnight Boy and turned it into a sequel and a novel. But he originally wrote it as a sequel to Lassie, to the story Lassie. And there's correspondence on this that I read, describing how they were going back and forth about it. And he describes the reason. He says the story, he mentions towns like Alms Hat, Double Trouble, Mount Misery, Batstow, Martha's Furnace, Harrisville, and Bamber. These are all things that he mentions in this story. He described the region as where, quote, deer play around all year long until they crash wide-eyed into slaughter. It also features some big-time poaching, and it also features the mills over there. He describes some of the ruins of the mills. At Zion, a foundry town that supplied cannons for General George Washington. He also said that there are districts where the law is loath to enter, and any law officer who would crash bullheaded into an illicit deer killing in the pines would be mourned as not as a hero, but as one whose brain hadn't been working right. Midnight Boy was born at the stroke of midnight, which meant that he was going to be lucky all of his life. That was the thing that went along with being born at the strike of midnight, if you were born at midnight. And he and this woman, this colored woman that took care of him because he didn't know his parents, went in search of some of his parents' life, which happened to be in the pines, in the pine barrens. Once they got to this house, she knew where this house was. It was a frame house, enormous, and with one corner rising in a squared tower 4 stories high. A roofed veranda surrounded the ground floor, and there was another one above it, roofless but guarded by a carved balustrade. This house, I believe, still exists today in Weymouth, and there's a picture of it in the book there. Once inside the front door, the blackness of the musty hall was like pushing your face into the soft side of carbon paper. The 3rd floor held a labyrinth of chopped up rooms, each with an open door, each with a staring window. You could see the mill from there, and it was down a faded path, and it led to a brick smokestack 60 feet high. There was also low arches under which rusted the raceway. Walls of stone 3 feet thick broke a short or raised jagged tooth towards the sky. From a buttressed escarpment, you could look down into the walls that formed squares, oblongs, and even nests of vats, each with a narrow rectangle opening like a door. Anybody who's ever explored the mills in the pines, in the pine barrens, I mean, this is a very apt description, especially if you go to Horatia. I've been there a number of times, and it's a really good description. But again, it's an interesting story. It talks about the illicit trade in poaching, and there's a very interesting girl that comes along that becomes friends with the midnight boy. But some other interesting aspects to it also. Lord Buff and the Silver Star. We were talking a little earlier about Lord Buff. His actual name was Lord Buffington. And it was Chamberlain's last dog. And when asked about the story one time, Chamberlain said that Lord Buff helped him write the book. It's a novelette written with children and young-minded adults. Silver Star is the trotter, and a special trotter driven by a boy. So that the actual title is Lord Buff and the Silver Star, and it was his last novel.
And what year was that?
55. Okay, 55. From that point on, he got nothing published. He was not able to get anything more published. And by that time, the price of writing serials and things for the magazines had dropped dramatically. You were lucky if you got $1,000. Where for a lot of his other ones, he was getting $25,000, $27,000, $30,000 to write them. It says there was a split fence between where he lived and the farm next door. And again, it's set at Lloyd's Landing and Cundy's place. Into his life, this is about the boy, into his life came a stranger. He asked him his name, and the stranger frowned. Preacher. Yeah, as a babe in the arms of my old grandmammy, Esterline, I was give preacher for a first name to go with Snow, and that's what I growed up with, to be a leader of the all-loving Brethren and Gideon Church over in Shiloh. Now, Chamberlain did attend a black church in Bucktown, which is outside of Alloway. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. Is there such a place?
I'm not sure of that.
It's on the road over towards Woodstown. You go around the lake and out that way. Yeah, okay. Okay. He describes trotters, and he describes their effect on people. Thus it is decreed that only the trotters, as they lay their bellies to the ground, infect the high and the low, white or black, male or female, with an incurable malady known as a horse bug fever. This is what he thinks about people that really get into the trotting circuits and watching them and following them. But the thunder of those trotting hoofs, once heard within a thumping heart, has the power to echo down the years, reversing age into youth under its magic spell. Fatal. But what if the germ is in the blood from the day of your birth, transmitted in a bloodline from father to son? Then indeed there is no hope of escape. And Todd felt the truth of it in his aching bones. Consequently, it was practically ordained that once inside the great gate, he should discover a dream world beyond anything he could have imagined, and the shock of his wonders slowed the pace. So again, he gets into describing what it's like to be in a race from the point of view of the driver. And this again, this was a boy. All of his drivers that he describes, with the exception of one, whose name was Red-Eyed Bergmann, with two N's.
No kidding.
Yeah, it was, when I read that, who knew, right? All of his other drivers were youngsters, young. While he was researching this book, or some of the things for the book, and he writes about this in the book. He saw an article, a banner heading caught his attention. It announced an imported miracle. It told how the soybean, recently introduced from the far inscrutable East, was constituted a multiple handout from God to any hard-pressed farmer. Not only had its plunging roots loaded with fantastic globules of moisture, the power to restore impoverished soil, but after providing 2 cuttings of the richest kind of hay, undaunted, the plants would go on to produce mature beans. No plowing, simply cut harrow, broadcast by hand, and harrow again. So this is what he did, at Lloyd's Landing too. And this is, again, I'm sure why he wrote about doing, as part of this book. This is what the boy came up with to, improve the money coming into the farm. Okay, now. Pass those around. There's the rest of the novels we just talked about. Now we get to the last one. This does not bear George Agnew's name. It bears the name of Michael Brandon. He wrote this one with a pen name. To me, it is really a semi-autobiography of his life. And it's called Nonce. Okay? Nonce. Written under the pen name Michael Brandon, this story is an autobiography woven into a spellbinding novel. On the inside of the dust jacket it read, "Start this book under no illusion. In its distinguished way, it is a real shocker, full of sex, violence, murder, witchcraft, and excitement. It is complete, it's complex, imaginative, and powerful. A book ahead of its time. If you read all of Chamberlain's other novels and nonfiction books, articles, and research his life, there are unmistakable parallels that lead to only one conclusion as to who really wrote this book. And he did write the book, because there are letters available that when he was going to great lengths to make sure his name didn't get associated with it when he was writing it. He did write other things about voodooism. It's interesting, his parents were all missionaries, and most of the rest of his family were either preachers or in missionary work. But he never, he was called by the family, the black sheep of the family. And he never joined a church. He never became a Presbyterian. And after reading all of his things, I think he probably fits into the category of an agnostic. And he and his mother had many letters exchanged where she tried to get him to come to the fold. But he always had some reason that he wouldn't do it. But anyway, he wrote this story. It's a story of the swamplands. And that's South Jersey. When the guy that he modeled the author after was supposedly from Mississippi, and he was an engineer, and he traveled all over the world, and all that kind of stuff. But it actually, you can see in the descriptions where Alloway plays into it, where some of the wharfs and things that are down at Bayside are in it, and the railroad that led down to them. So but he really is explaining some of the things that happened to him as he lived. In fact, he describes that building in the novel, the one that looks like New Orleans. Yeah. Yeah.
When was that published, Jim?
This was published in the middle 40s. Yeah. It's available online.
Jim?
Yes.
I don't know if the audience can handle, but I always liked that piece, that little piece that he wrote on, with the Damiana.
Yes, Damiana.
I mean, the sarcasm.
Right. Well, I was going to get into some of his other stories. We have a little bit of time yet? Yeah, a couple of minutes. This is one of the stories that never got made into a novel. It's called Jared, Last of the Pinies. And it's a very good read. This is another one that never got made into a novel or even into a serial. It's called The Scabbard and the Knife. And it's about Port Norris, about the oyster industry in the area. It was also called Southwest Line. This is how he starts it out. Let me move back over here. Let me see if I can get you started here in a good place. No, that's not what I want. Okay, we'll forget that. It's changing, and in his exchanges with the editors at Saturday Evening Post, they felt it was not something that the people would read. Now, if you publish that today, I think people would read it. As you can, this is just a representation of some of the serials, and you can see how much artwork went into these things. He had 43 of these things in the Saturday Evening Post. and he had them on Africa, he had them on South America. Why is he unknown? I mean, the more I read about the gentleman, it made no sense. That he, and maybe it's, maybe some of it's due to the response that I got when I called Princeton and asked them what they had about him. And they had very little. Even though he was, a student there. Lawrenceville had a little more, but not a lot. But then again, you read, you look at the newspapers over the time period that he was writing, and there's all kinds of articles about him, and all the different things that he wrote.
But there's lots of writers like that just disappear.
I guess.
From the
Same with Dallas Moore Sharp. He was famous in his day.
Yeah, well, if you read his stuff on feminism, and he did some writing on feminism, and other women's rights and things in the 20s that are in his novels, they're very much like today. And you can see how things have changed. I mean, he had, when he wrote Home, one of the reviews of it, because it was written anonymously, thought it was a woman that wrote it. Because he was that sympathetic to women's feelings. And he did have a daughter, Georgette, who was fathered while he was in France. He had an apartment in Paris when he was writing over there, and she was his housekeeper. He kept in touch with her the whole time that she was living. She didn't die until 1993. I've corresponded with the family over there. There's pictures of her in that one book there. She never married. She had problems with that, which she explained in some letters that she wrote to her father, and he wrote back, his comments on it. So
Check these out later.
here he was, right among us, from 1927 until 1966, and there are people right here that knew him. You might want to talk with him. And that's my story of George Agnew Chamberlain and his South Jersey novel.
You have to say where he was buried.
Well, he's buried in Bridgeton in Broad Street Cemetery, along with 8 other relatives. Now, 2 of his relatives were cremated, and their ashes were strewn in Alloway Creek, but they still appear on the marker, even though they're not there.
Was his family for many generations rooted in this area?
No. Now, the reason his mother wound up here in Bridgeton after his father died, she stayed in South America for about 5 years after the father died, and then she came here because her cousin was Reverend Vidal from the Second Presbyterian Church. So that's how she wound up in Bridgeton. And in the Lot House, the one right next to the parsonage that belongs to the First Presbyterian Church, that big gray house. Yes.
Were there any mules in Scudder? Hey, I noticed they didn't get any billing on the advertisements.
Oh yeah, there were mules from Texas. Not from South Jersey. There are many of these other, his 4 earlier films were all made in the 1920s. They were silent films. Taxi, White Man, Coming Home. There's one other one that skips me right now. But, like I say, he had 7 films made, which I think, You read of some of these writers, they get one film. Some of the well-known, quote, well-known writers, they get one film.
I just want to say that what you've evoked from this whole life of work is that Chamberlain had an incredible sense of place, and that's really his gift to literature, that he was capable of representing this very unique landscape in a very, very rich way.
Right.
Unfortunately, I think, from what I've read of him, he wasn't as good at integrating human experience with it. I mean, occasionally he comes up with a really a very characteristic character who belongs to the place, and so the person becomes part of the place. I think Lantern on the Plow is a very good instance of that, in which the character is himself and herself too, the girl, are really kind of flowerings of the landscape themselves. And so he's good at that. And unless you know and have that kind of passion for this area, maybe it just doesn't resonate with other communities. I'm thinking that maybe that's why, in part, he doesn't get the kind of reverence that you think he deserves. I'm particularly fond of the fact that he represented the space where I live, right next to the Shepherd House, so beautifully in that Lantern on the Plow novel. And even that wall, that terrible fallen wall, with its what was then its periwinkle overhang. And if you go by that wall now in the springtime and early summer, you can still see the periwinkle. Of course, the winter jasmine now has taken over, but the periwinkle is still there.
Right.
So there's a kind of capturing of that unique place that he is really master of.
Yeah, but I think we read other things of other areas and we get that feel. So why not the feel for the stuff that he wrote of areas by other people that don't live in the area?
Well, because it's not, in those other cases, it's not the only thing that they do. They may also create characters that are really memorable or emotional conflicts that never leave us. I think in that respect, Chamberlain is a little thin.
Okay.
That's my judgment call. I don't know, I'd like to hear from others on that.
Well, if you read his two nonfiction books, about the African safaris that he went on, and the other one about Mexico, is Mexico worth saving? See, he was in Mexico at the time of the First World War. And he was in Africa in the teens, from like 09 to up into the 1916. He was there at the time of the war. In fact, he even went over to Germany during the war to look at the internment camps over there. And he writes about that. And his African books are very enlightening as far as the tribes and the mores and things that went on at that particular time, in Africa. And the same thing with the South American novels and stories. But anyway, I'd like to see more people read his stuff from here anyway.
Well, I think that's, the sense of place issue is important. I think that's what's telling. I think what you're probably intimating, Jim, is that, like Dallas Lewis Sharp, we'll just pick two of them, Dallas Lewis Sharp and George Agnew Chamberlain. If those authors, and Sharp does have a following nationally and internationally, but Chamberlain, if he was a New England writer, you can bet your buttons those New Englanders would be promoting that to the hilt. That's the thing, is that people around here don't know much about it, George Agnew Chamberlain, which is fascinating, given the fact, as a cultural historian who studies this region, that material is really rich, that evocation of place and those landscapes that he really, beautifully depicts. So I think that's now we're getting to a sore spot in my life, which is, we're engaged in this perennial fight against South Jersey history.
Well, he needs a good literary critic to write an article in Sojourn or something and really sing his praises. I mean, somewhere, somebody has to say that, has to elevate his profile, and I think that hasn't happened.
It may be coming.
Oh, good.
At one time, this area was described as the literary capital of New Jersey because of all the different writers that are from here.
Well, there was Walt Whitman at our doorstep.
Yeah, and a lot of them right out of the Bridgeton area. Very good writers.
Name a couple more then.
Yeah.
Name a couple more.
Yeah. Very well known local writers. Dallas Lord Sharp. George Agnew Chamberlain.
Admiral Potter.
Who?
Admiral Potter.
Well, we really appreciate your persistence and work on behalf of Chamberlain, and maybe we will learn more.